spanning the globe. It's World Affairs Roundup.
The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents World Affairs Roundup, a monthly edition of International Focus, providing opinion and analysis of global events, with John Kotzka, a retired member of the U.S. Foreign Service, Ann Hamilton, political scientist at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service, and Robert Craig, Executive Director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin and author of articles and books on American foreign policy. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now, here's your moderator, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus and another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Robert Craig is on assignment in Washington this week, but we're pleased to have UWM Associate Professor Jeff Summers rounding out our prescient panel of pundits as we take a look at Center Stage. Israeli voters defied conventional wisdom about an inevitable rightward shift, thrusting a new center-left party into the role of indispensable coalition partner. What drove the shift, and will it make a difference in Israeli policy? Mr. Morsi's Egypt. Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi brushed aside calls for a new unity government despite ongoing violent protests that have defined his brief presidency. Meanwhile, Egypt's top general warned that the state was in danger of collapse. What's next in that nation's tortured political transition? Darling, we've got to talk. In a long-awaited speech, British Prime Minister David Cameron burnished his Eurosceptic credentials by calling for a referendum on whether Britain should remain in the EU. Is this domestic politicking or a real retreat from the founding vision of an ever-closer union? And Cold War revisited. A recent series of punitive tit-for-tat measures between Moscow and Washington recall a frostier era in U.S.-Russian relations. Are these differences of substance, or is anti-Americanism the new smart political play for Russia's elected officials? Well, welcome back, you two. Welcome, Jeff. Glad you could be with us. We could start in Israel in a number of fronts, including on this air. It was considered a foregone conclusion that whatever government coalition obtained after this election would be a dramatic shift to the right, and they fooled us. So, John, tell us what happened.
Well, we, Robert and I, with your approval, thought that Netanyahu was going to command the election. He won. He got he and his Israel Beitenu partners got 31 of the 120 Knesset seats. This is down from 43 that they had before. The surprise of this particular election is the rise of a new party, Yesh Atid. Yesh Atid, and its head, an actor and TV personality by the name of Yair Lapid. And he has been anointed as a center-left, and he and his party is center-left, but it really is kind of a wild card into this process because his agenda appears to be very domestic, over standard of living issues and about a particular little tiff he has with the ultra-Orthodox parties about how they managed to get out of military service. On the external affairs, he seems to be much in lock with Netanyahu's position and looks like he would be a comfortable coalition partner.
So what does that tell us about sort of the electorate? I mean, this is, as far as the demographics of who voted for him, how did he get to the number 2 spot?
Well, the party list that he put together is supposed to be a professional, urbane, more intellectual, middle-class set of voters, and there have been some comparisons to an Obama-type character here, somebody who represents a moderate centrist position that can save Israel from itself by instead of going veering far to the left or far to the right. And he did appeal to the economic and social concerns of his voters, and that has given some people hope. But his party won 19 seats out of 120, so his party was the party that came in second. But he's new to the political field, so people don't really know how much stock to put into him.
So Jeff, just in Israel particularly, but in parliamentary systems in general, talk a little bit about what happens when there's an election like this where nobody has an absolute majority.
Sure. Well, I mean, essentially, I think you see what we see all over the world, and that is that, especially in the more advanced countries around the globe, we don't see much movement at all. And so I think people are very frustrated with the lack of any particular political party to be able to affect any kind of significant change. And we've seen this for about the past 20 years in Europe. And many people have said that we've seen the same thing in the United States. And so I think to a certain extent that's what we're seeing here. And I would say that the center-left in Israel today is really the center-right. Just as we've seen, for instance, with many social democratic parties in the European Union, they've certainly migrated to the right. So rather than getting the expected rightward turn that we expected from this election, and having seen that turn occur since the mid-1990s in Israel, I think we have kind of settled into a status quo situation for the very reasons that both Anne and John have said. With respect to the settler question, which was not addressed here, we certainly are not going to see any progress on that score, I think, with Mr. Lapid and his potential coalition partner with Mr. Naftali Bennett is one which suggests that there's going to be a hard line with the Palestinian settlers going forward. And so any hopes for progress on that front, I think, are poorly timed and ill-conceived, unfortunately.
Well, and people have painted Yesh Atid, the new party, as sort of the party of the Israeli yuppies. I mean, is that what we saw? And in fact...
Or the Anglos, as some have called them.
Right. Some have said that the big issue is how are they going to continue to be able to afford their vacations in Tuscany. Right. I mean, was that the overarching issue for voters?
I can't respond to that particularly, but you also have to look back at where Israel is right now internationally. I mean... Right. You have to look at the UN General Assembly elevation of the Palestinian Authority to an observer status, which is being perceived in Israel as a major blow. And then you have on top of that, just within hours ago, the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations came out with a finding saying to Israel, no more settlers. And not only that, you have to pull all the settlers off of the occupied part of the West Bank. Mm-hmm. And if you don't do this, you are subject to war crime.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and I think that I should have said that earlier, and when you were talking who voted for this, I think this sense of isolation is really strong. And of course you have the Arab Spring surrounding them, so that's the larger context.
Well, and then there's one more thing, is this documentary that is now up for an Academy Award for an Oscar called The Gatekeeper, and this is an interview of 6 of the former heads of the Israeli Security Service that come down very hard on what is how the ultra-right has been driving Israeli politics. Mm-hmm. So these are 3 kind of black eyes that are out there right now that Israel has to deal with.
I mean, as one of the ex-Mossad heads has said, the position actually turns you into a leftist. I started on the right, and I became a leftist at the end.
Well, let's stay in the region and take a look at Egypt. General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the head of Egypt's military, warned the civilian government, basically, the state is on the brink of collapse, and given the history of the region, and Egypt particularly, when the top military guy says, I'm concerned about what you politicians are doing, you would do well to notice. So where are we on the ground now? I mean, first of all, what is the most proximate crisis caused by?
Well, I think it's largely an economic crisis. And so I think to a certain extent, when we follow all of these changes in political parties and personnel, this is kind of foam on the water. What we're seeing throughout the region is a response to a really significant increase in food prices that began in the last part of the last decade. So in Egypt, we see a 40% increase in food imports, or rather 40% of their food being imported, 60% of their wheat being imported. So they're having to try and raise all this foreign exchange to pay for this. Their population is soaring. And this is all aggravated by the United States, which has begun to convert, not begun, but has converted much of its agricultural land to biofuels, which has taken a good bit of agricultural land out of production for food export, global warming, which has created droughts, and quantitative easing, not only in the United States, but in some other countries as well, which has created all this surplus capital, which is raised into commodity markets, thus boosting food prices even more. So it's really kind of a perfect storm for this kind of political instability in countries like Egypt.
Well, and on top of that, you have two sections of the population, the secularist and the Islamicist, who aren't willing to talk to each other. I mean, where have we seen that recently? In our own country.
Right.
And a total lack of trust in any kind of authority, from the police to the political parties to the presidency to the... some people are actually looking back to the military as perhaps their greatest hope. But
well, and in fact, that was interesting. And when curfews were called following some of the recent violence, they were just largely ignored, and that certainly wouldn't have happened in earlier days of the regime. So what does that say? I mean, is there some sort of existential crisis of authority on the part of the government?
Well, I think it's all of the above. I mean, the economics drove the Arab Spring in the first place. I mean, we kept thinking that this was a great rush for freedom, but this had to do with 20% increase in the cost of grain.
Right.
And it looks like, as part of the perfect storm, that the military should intervene. But the military, of course, remembers what happened not too long ago, and they're very reluctant to jump into it again in case you have yet another phase of the revolution.
The military is not what it once was. I mean, a half a century and more ago, the military might intervene, and it might be comprised of young officers who were nationalists, who believed in order and the interests of national development. Now they're a mix of opportunists and radical ideologists.
And old men.
Yeah, I mean, they're not what they used to be, fortunately and unfortunately.
So where do we go? There was a meeting where the parties did at least sit down and talk.
Well, and that was important. And part of that happened because, in addition to his public announcement, I saw reference that he called the secularists in, Baradei and who's the other secularist party chief. He called both of them in and read the Riot Act to them, saying you've got to start beginning to accommodate what's going on here. The fall of the Muslim Brotherhood is not going to be good for Egypt. So that's what's precipitating this now. Now, whether or not this goes anywhere with those economic conditions prevailing is very hard to see.
Well, we'll leave Western Asia. When we come back, we'll take a stop in Europe. But first, we'll take a short break.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus and our World Affairs Roundup with John Kotzka, Ann Hamilton, and Jeff Summers. Well, Jeff, David Cameron gave a long-awaited speech recently in which he was promising to hold a referendum in or out, Britain and the EU.
Right.
What was that about?
Sure. Well, you know, the euro for the UK is like a big party piñata that they just love to whack at. And it's wonderful internal politics for them for a variety of reasons, both because of just the rather conservative bent, I would say, of the English generally, but also, of course, because of the poor performance of the euro and of the European Union generally with a currency union. So this is just great politics at the moment, both internally and also in terms of sending a message to Brussels as well, and to the Germans, to the ECB, to Frankfurt, So, not only can you get this internal political support back that perhaps you're beginning to lose to the libertarians with the United Kingdom's Independence Party headed by Nigel Farage, who, has this kind of rock and roll swagger as a metals trader and a drinker of pints of beer at night, a smoker of cigarettes, and boasts of conquest with Latvian women at night. He's somebody who appeals to that kind of London financial district culture.
Well,
now you take that stick away from him that he was using currently, and that is the absurdity of having a euro being introduced to the United Kingdom, whose economy is based on offshore finance in London. I mean, this would essentially destroy London's comparative advantage in the global economy. I think they have no interest in doing it in any kind of serious way. And then it also has, again, a kind of Kim Jong-un crazy man appeal. Again, when you're dealing with the EU and again with the European Central Bank, you can argue that, look, we can really go crazy on this and just completely withdraw from the European Union if you don't cooperate with us a little bit more and give us whatever autonomy we ask for.
I think he's also tapping, there's a strong EU anti-sentiment, and obviously the polls showed that 50% of the British said that they would leave the EU now without any changes, as opposed to 36% that would stay in. But I think that one of the issues that the top issue that they want to take back, according to this poll from Brussels, is immigration. And there is, given all their economic crisis, they're very concerned about the number of EU immigrants who are coming over, and the fact that next year there's supposed to be completely free immigration for the Romanians and the Bulgarians after a 7-year period when it was limited. And so he's tapping into something that's more than symbolic, I think. It's really a critical issue for a lot of people in their times of austerity.
Well, there have been people that have responded on the Brussels side of the equation saying this is not a cafeteria, you can't pick and choose the parts of the agreement you like and the part you don't. Is that likely to happen? I mean, are they going to be able to decide we like this part, we don't like that?
How can you say anything bad about someone who says something bad about the Brussels bureaucrats? But you also have to remember that the way in which most of this has gone down has not been by any referenda. This has been by national assemblies who have voted this stuff on, sometimes in opposition to prevailing public opinion. So this, first of all, he's talking about 2017. So let's get realistic about whether or not this is an impending thing. But second of all, the idea of referenda is something that gets Brussels very nervous.
Right.
Well, let's open it up a little further to sort of the wider economic situation in the Eurozone right now. The Economist recently had a piece saying perhaps it's time to break out the champagne, and the cost of money for some of the troubled peripheral economies has actually come down. And then we hear that actually the situation is worse. Yeah, right. So what's the story?
Cyprus is now on the ropes, and is not prepared to make the kinds of changes that the Germans are likely to insist on. Greece is not anywhere out of the woods.
The Greeks are cutting down trees to burn in their homes.
And they're striking right now.
Right. I mean, in effect, nothing has been solved. And just because you have a few bond traders that are happy, doesn't necessarily mean that the situation in the European Union has improved. And the borrowing costs, while they may be lower for a few countries, does not also suggest that there's anything like success. It just means that there's not an immediate pending implosion of the entire Eurozone and of the euro currency. So it's the same as it ever was. I mean, we still have the same problem in which there is not a means by which capital can be successfully recycled from rich countries to the poor countries within Europe. And as long as this situation persists, we're going to continue to have underdevelopment in the EU and Euro periphery and this kind of instability going forward.
And Germany contracted its economy contracted in the fourth quarter of last year, which is the cash cow that has been feeding this whole thing.
Absolutely.
So how does austerity feed into this in the British context? I mean, we know how the Greeks feel about it, but there's been quite a pinch on the average Brit, has there not?
Everywhere it's been tried and imposed. I mean, it's been very, very harsh. I mean, whether it's Ireland, Spain, of course we know Greece. So it's quite unpopular in the United Kingdom as well. And again, the only thing that has perhaps helped them is having an independent currency. So it's because they have monetary autonomy, they can borrow in their own currency, so they don't have to worry about these excessive borrowing costs. And they understand that the euro has hurt the other countries much more severely that are going through this austerity. So, why would they select it? And that's why Cameron's speech was such a home run. Again, hitting the right notes domestically and with Brussels and also with the ECB in Frankfurt. They will shoot for autonomy. They will say they want it their own way. They will go for this a la carte menu, and they'll say, you'll have it our way or else.
Right. And is there truly an or else? Could you see a point at which referendum or no, British policymakers would just say thank you, but we'll go our own way?
I don't think the EU is going to confront them on this because I think they're worried about the collapse of the Eurozone in the future. I mean, it looks, again, more stable than it did a year ago, but that's not saying much.
And then you have accession talks that are going on through the former Yugoslavia and elsewhere, where this could only add to the fire rather than pour some fire extinguisher fluid on it.
So, at retail level, I mean, if you're just the average working Brit in the pub, why is there such Euroscepticism, do you think?
I think
and you referenced the poll that said, 50% would say we'd leave right now if we could.
Right. Well, there's always been a sense of we're different. I mean, it's very, very deep in their history, and they, did not join the Union until 1973 because they thought that they could go it alone, and they didn't want to be part of Europe, part of that. So that I think it's entirely consistent with the attitudes that they've generally have had historically. So it doesn't surprise me that much, particularly in a time of austerity, where you do have floods. The times I've been in London recently, it does feel very different when you go into restaurants and all. I mean, there are a lot of immigrants coming in for jobs because it was the economy that was doing better. And so I can see where the average person in the pub.
It was the Polish plumber that caused the French constitutional defeat.
Well, we can go to another place where a nation's sense of itself may be driving politics, and that's Russia. John, maybe you could take the first swing at this one. What's behind this sort of tit-for-tat process? The Duma has recently enacted or proposed things that include, of course, the ban on U.S. adoptions, but ban on foreigners from appearing on state TV if they discredit the Russian state.
Aimed at two people in particular.
20% of all films shown commercially must be Russian in origin.
Good God, that sounds like France.
Right?
It sounds like France.
Purging Russian of Americanisms. So, it starts at some level, the sort of proximate tit-for-tat was this Magnitsky Act. Talk a little bit about that, if you will.
Well, Magnitsky was worked for an international company that became aware of the amount of tax fraud that was going on, and he called this to authorities' attention. He was incarcerated and he died in prison. Yeah. There was a number of investigations, and there was nothing that seemed to have come out of it that would satisfy international observers.
So fast forward, U.S. Congress.
The U.S. Congress passed an act in 2012 that was largely to replace the Jackson-Vanik, which meant holding human rights and personal liberties as one of the markers for Russian performance and for cooperation with Russia.
So is this? And of course, the Russians didn't like that. One United Russia Party official said, well, you replaced an anti-Soviet law with an anti-Russian law, so big deal. But this isn't just about we don't like that particular law and tit for tat. There's something deeper here, isn't there?
Putin has been trying to create what they're calling a new ideology that's based on patriotism, the church, the provinces, and creating a sense that we need to go, I mean, this is consistent with history too, to go to the true Russia that's anti-Western, and saying that foreigners are the enemy, basically. So Americans are the biggest target, but it's consistent with this idea of creating a new ideology, which helps him in his, fight with the opposition, basically.
Well, remember, when he came into power, in his last election, he didn't get quite the kind of percentages that people thought, and so Westerners were beginning to question whether or not he was still in charge. And then there were the demonstrations on the street, and we tend to enlarge the importance of those because they're very visible, but they were a factor that he was having to deal with. And so some of this flows out of that, as well as this slap in the face from the U.S. Congress.
But this is an authentic movement, isn't it? It's at some level. I mean, this really is how many Russians see their place in the world.
Well, it is. I mean, of course, we have to remember that it's one of the few states that represents a civilization, and you really feel that when you go to Russia. And I was just in Moscow and Novosibirsk a few months ago, and the sense of nostalgia for the Soviet system is growing. And people are very unhappy with the government. So I think in many respects, this is a response to people's increasing dissatisfaction, and especially the middle class, which has taken such a beating the past 20 years.
Well, there's a leitmotif globally for us.
Exactly.
We're going to have
even
to leave
more
it at
so
that.
there.
John Kotzka, Ann Hamilton, Jeff Summers, thanks a lot to our viewers. We'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,